Well, hello, everybody. My name is Sam Henson, and I am the Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs for Lockton Retirement Services. And today I get to talk to you about the government retirement update. I know it's a fascinating title, it's enthralling, but we're going to talk today about what's going on both in the general election between the two candidates that impacts retirement policy, as well as what's going on in Congress. And then we'll have some time to talk a little bit specifically about what the regulatory agencies are doing and looking ahead down the road. I know that anytime we talk politics and partisan politics, especially, that this can be a heated discussion. But hopefully you'll have some good questions today. If you do have questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A over to the right hand, and I will keep an eye on those and make sure I get to them. If for some reason I don't answer your question right on time, it's probably because I'm going to hold that until I get to a certain section that I think it either might address that and answer it for you, or it's probably more applicable. But please, by all means, ask as many questions as you like. And I will do my best not to anger anybody today. I know we are in an interesting time when it comes to the government and politics in general. But the beauty of things is generally we're all here today because we agree on retirement. And especially the nature of the employer-sponsored retirement system. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Again, just myself there. You can see I would much rather be talking in front of everybody in person, but the folks at Excel have done a wonderful time of putting together our digital series, and so hopefully we'll find this just as useful. So what are we going to discuss? Well, we're going to start with election 2020, and I'm going to talk to you a little about where things are going and how things are lining up. And then we will make sure that we talk about what the two candidates' administrations could look like in terms of their retirement policy and what their agendas are. And then we're going to switch over and talk about the election's impact on both the Senate and the House and how things are shaping up. And then look at the legislative agenda, both what's going on right now and what we would anticipate based on certain outcomes. And then we'll shift to the regulatory. And then again, if we have any questions at the end, happy to answer those as well. Let's get right to it. If you have been living under a rock and are not aware, we do have a general election coming up in just a few weeks. The tables are set. We have President Trump against Vice President Biden. Those are our candidates. It's a fascinating time right now. The election of 2020, while a lot of people think has a lot of parallels with 2016, it's really not shaping up to be that way for a lot of different reasons. First of all, 2016 was really only, I guess, maybe the fifth time in our nation's history that the Electoral College decided an election. And it very well could be the sixth time this way around. It's hard to know. If you look at history, the other ones that were decided other than 2016, it was 2000 between Bush v. Gore. And then prior to that, you have to go all the way back to the 1800s where you have Harrison, Rutherford B. Hayes, and John Q. Adams, where their elections were chosen by the Electoral College. So a big part of history has really happened over the last few elections, and we'll see what happens. In 2016, though, to be clear, Trump won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. Only 56% of America turned out to vote, so relatively low numbers. Will we get bigger turnout this time? Well, if it's any indication on what the early voting numbers are and the mail-in ballots, probably we're going to have significantly more than 56%. It's not going to reach 80 to 90% just because America is generally apathetic when it comes to elections. Even presidential elections that are highly politicized like this, they just don't turn out to vote. There will be more TikTok videos posted on election day than there will be votes cast. So it's just, it's the reality of the world we live in. But if you look back at 16, really Trump's win came in some really key states that a lot of people didn't expect him to carry in the Electoral College, and really were states that traditionally Republicans didn't do well again. And these are going to be what you're seeing everybody refer to as battleground states right now. It's Michigan, it's Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, North Carolina, and of course Arizona, which is traditionally a swing state. Those close call states in 2016, New Hampshire, Minnesota, Nevada, and Maine are all in play as well. But the real question is, can he continue to build momentum in those states that he carried the last time, or is he spread out? Right now, going into the last few weeks, President or Vice President Biden is carrying a double-digit lead over President Trump. It's anywhere from 10 to 16%, depending on the time of day or the poll that you look at. But that's not too far off from where we were in the general election in 2016. So it'll be, we'll have to just keep an eye on this right now. President Trump's approval rating has been fairly consistent over the last 12 months, hovering between 40 to 45%. When COVID initially hit, it took a hit, but then, he's kind of rebounded. But I don't really think you look at his general approval rating. You look at his approval rating amongst his supporters, and it's well into the mid-90s. And there's no reason to think that that's not going to continue as we move forward. Looking at the polling maps, and again, polls are, obviously not an indicator of, in the truest sense, but they're a very scientific way, especially in today's polling, and a very accurate way of predicting things right now. Biden, depending on where it sits right now, is got about a 283 lead in the Electoral College, and you need 270 to win. Again, anything can happen, and things did happen strangely the last time around. But that's where the polling map is sitting right now amongst folks. I say that because this is a quote directly from me the day before the election the last time around. I said in a session similar to this, where I was talking about Washington retirement policy, I said, listen, folks, the path to victory for Trump is so unlikely. We're going to talk most of our time about what a Clinton presidency will look like based on her agenda. And I clearly could not stick my foot further into my own mouth. And so I have the caveat, at no time will I make any firm predictions about what happens come November. And I clearly was wrong, like a lot of people were the last time around. But 2020 is not 2016. And there's a lot of reasons for that. First of all, the polling is certainly better now. It's still not perfect, but the accuracy of polling is much better. In fact, you have the ability now to really track individuals as they affirmatively exit the polls to see that they did physically vote. So when somebody says they're a likely voter, you have the way to confirm that. And just the polls, the data is more real time and that sort of stuff, and they have the ability to track a lot more as well. I think another thing that's still the same here is that you have these Trump supporters who are not vocal. And what I mean by that are probably those individuals who generally identify with the GOP, are generally fiscally conservative individuals, but maybe don't identify with Trump, the individual, as much. And so largely they don't agendize with the Democrats. They're not going to vote Democrat, but they're also not the folks that have the yard signs out right now or going to the Trump rallies or the boat parades that you've seen all summer, those sort of things. So how big is that number? We don't know. But they are out there just like they were the last time around, and they're likely not going to come over and vote on the other side. The real question is there's a really vocal enthusiasm that's anti-Trump. The question is, will that become pro-Biden? Will that translate? The Democrats went into this and into the primaries very bifurcated amongst the Sanders supporters and the Warren supporters and some of the more progressive Democrats that were out there. And, Biden presented the best chance to beat Trump in most regards, and so that's who our candidate is. The question will be, are those individuals who are Bernie supporters or Warren supporters, will they come out and vote Biden? Will they realize that's the best chance they have to defeat Trump, or will they be angry and disenfranchised and not do it? So we don't know. What's different this time around? Well, Trump has a record. We now have 4 years of his actions to really see what he would do and how he would do it. And so that will impact the voters in their opinion of him. Biden's polling numbers right now are much stronger than Clinton's were at this same time last year. Clinton was a very polarizing candidate. Biden is to some degree, but not nearly as it was for Clinton. Biden has a much stronger ground game. And then lessons learned, Clinton, especially in the last election, gave up on a lot of states that were thought to be shoe-ins, and Trump really canvassed hard in those states, and so he ended up pulling those out. And so I think what you'll see is the Biden the Biden campaign really focusing up to the last minute. One of the biggest issues right now is a massive Trump fundraising advantage. And I'm not necessarily referring to the dollars raised by the campaigns. It's about, based on what I've seen recently, it's about $1.2 billion for Trump versus about $800 million for Biden. But the real advantage that an incumbent president has is the value of the stage and the media presence that they carry every single day as a sitting president. And by some estimates, just that media time, the news coverage, his name constantly being mentioned, good or bad, the old adage that any press is good press, can be upwards worth about $5 billion. And so the advantage that Trump has just in the media presence of being a sitting president far exceeds what both of them have raised. So we'll have to see how that plays out. The other thing that Trump is having to focus on is he's also campaigning for a lot of the congressional elections that are really tight right now. And so he's spending some time there, not just focusing on his own campaign. Biden is spending a lot more on commercials right now, which, with people stuck at home is mattering. TV viewership is up significantly, and so that's going to potentially have an impact. Trump is knocking on doors, whereas the Biden campaign really isn't doing the grassroots canvassing. They're respectful of the restrictions that are in place for COVID and want to be pro social distancing and those sort of things. So they're not knocking on people's doors, whereas the Trump campaign is doing that. And then lastly, I just think it's important, one of the things that during the Obama administration in his two campaigns, he had a groundswell of grassroots supports, upwards of about 2.5 million supporters that came out to help his campaign. And Trump learned from that. And in fact, there's a book out there, if you ever get to read it, called Groundbreakers, but it talks about how they were able to win that campaign with that grassroots support. And a lot of the Trump senior level campaign staffers have had to read that and learn from that. And they've implemented quite a few policies that tie with that. So again, I don't think that this election is the same and we can't draw the same comparisons, but will that translate to a specific win by one individual or the other? I don't know. Probably the biggest thing that most of you want to know is what is their retirement policy? Well, Trump has largely, initially reversed the Obama era regulations and policies that were put in place. Most significantly, the Department of Labor's fiduciary investment advice rule as it relates to advice and recommendations to participants. The DOL had worked on that for a significant amount of time. And then once the Trump administration came in, they facilitated a very difficult path for that to be enacted. And then eventually, it died in the courts. And then the rule that's proposed right now is a much more watered down rule that would reinstate the 5-part test. And we'll talk about that later. And then the other thing is, on the way out the door, the Obama administration issued an executive order that would firmly exempt a lot of these state mandatory IRAs from being ERISA covered whatsoever. And then one of the first things the Trump administration did was to repeal that via another executive order. And so, that policy has largely been to reverse that. Trump policies have largely been pro-plan sponsor or definitely pro-financial services, as we've seen some of the things that we'll talk about with the ESG rule, the proxy voting rule, and the private equity guidance that was released. The Secure Act obviously was a great deal on the Trump indication of the retirement policy, although I would argue that the Secure Act was much more of a legislative initiative and not really one of the administration. RISA and the other initiatives, the SAFE Act and some of those that have been out there, have been around for a while. And then other things that's kind of ancillary, the Trump administration has toyed around with the idea of these sidecar HSAs or universal emergency savings accounts, kind of tax-deferred accounts that you can use to spend on emergencies and just accumulate on sitting aside like an HSA for a wider use. One significant point, because many of you may work for multi-employer defined benefit plans, the Trump administration has expressed no desire to do anything that would help facilitate the funding liabilities of those plans. On the other side of that, you have the Biden, the Biden campaign, what they said. And kind of buried in the headline was his concept, and he's mentioned this in a few different places, and then in the coalition that he's built, that he would look to replace the tax-deferred retirement system that we have with tax-deferred credits. So what does that mean? Well, essentially what he's getting at is if you look at somebody, let's say in that top marginal tax bracket of 37%, well, that means for every $1,000 that they would contribute to, $100 they would contribute to the retirement plan via the tax-deferred system, they get a $37 benefit. Somebody who's in that 10% marginal tax break, for every $100 they submit, they would get a 10% tax break. And so there's a feeling that we need to equalize that. And so the way that we think, and again, there's not been a lot of specificity around this, but the way that we think that the Biden campaign would look at this is replace it with flat tax credits. Essentially, everybody would get basically a 26% tax credit. So if you're putting in $10,000 a year in a plan, you'd get a tax credit of $2,600. Whether or not they're refundable or non-refundable, it's unclear. And obviously, that would have an impact on it. You'd have to pay the full amount in taxes to fully get the credit. And again, there's just not a lot of guidance on this. I really honestly think that this would be really hard to do. First of all, it would have a significant revenue impact. And then you've got to get both the House and the Senate on board. And unless we get a blue wave, where the Democrats take control of all aspects of government, this might be something hard to do. I think the other problem with this is, especially for small businesses and small plans, where the owner of that company largely recognizes a great deal of benefit from the work of having to offer a plan. If you reduce that tax benefit for that individual, it's unknown whether or not they would continue to decide to offer that plan and take on the fiduciary risk and all of the administrative duties. And so it generally presumes that if you do this, the world of plan sponsorship would continue down the path that would not make a different decision. And that's just an unknown. But that's probably the biggest issue on the Biden agenda. He's also supported the state regulations and mandates. If you remember, the Obama administration created the MyRA system, which was basically an optional IRA that was run by the federal government. I love the fact that it cost $2 to administer for every dollar taken in true government fashion, and it didn't survive. But it could be one of those things as these states start to create their own mandates. A Biden administration may do the same thing. He's also supported the fiduciary advice rule and has gone as far as say he would reinstate the Obama era proposed rule and see if there's a pathway to get that enacted. And so certainly that would be on his agenda. He's also supported a lot of the different initiatives, small tax credits, business tax startup credits, to help small business owners try to start up their own retirement plans. And then he clearly has also supported the multi-employer pension reforms that have been in place. As for Senator Harris, we don't really have a long track record. She hasn't served on some of the committees of jurisdiction that deal with retirement. But I think generally she's obviously going to align with the Biden initiatives. And so, her initiative would be to carry some of those out. One of the things that she ran on was a proposal that would incorporate a financial transaction tax. And you may have seen some of these legislative proposals. Really, these were kind of mechanisms to pay for other things. So, to the extent that we wanted free college tuition for everybody, or we wanted to wipe out student loan debt, how could you pay for that? And one of the proposals was that you create a financial transaction tax that would say for every time somebody purchases, sells a security, there would be some sort of 4 basis point tax or that sort of thing. Well, the problem is in these proposals, nobody ever thought to see how that would impact retirement plans, which are very large purchases of mutual funds, for example. And so what we wouldn't certainly want to do is have any type of proposal in place that would tax retirement contributions every time it's payday and your employees put money in the plan and buy securities. Or let's say they have a target date fund or managed account service or something where there's rebalancing going on, that would trigger the tax. And certainly upon distribution or a rollover to different funds, that would trigger. That would be bad for all. And there's data out there that would show the significant financial impact. If something like that were to take place, the retirement industry would really need to come together and lobby hard to get that exempted for qualified retirement plans, or that would really set back a lot of the work that we've done on deferral rates. So anyway, it's hard to know beyond what that they would do. Obviously you've got the enforcement agencies that would have agendas that the president can control, but we're really not sure there. I generally think a Biden win would signal a certain amount of pension risk transfers to probably take place, because there's a fear that there would be things done that would increase the funding obligations for single employer DB plans. You'd probably see the fiduciary rule again come back, and so you'd probably see the industry try to adjust on that sort of thing. There have been talks about decreasing the compensation limits for highly comp folks, or changing the rules to allow them to benefit lesser from that. And then, some of the other things that we talked about. Largely the ability for any president to get something done will hinge on the filibuster if they can't capture the Senate. And there has been talk about from Minority Leader Schumer and some other folks about whether or not they're willing to get rid of the filibuster. That's a big chip to play. If they do it, what you will see is that will have lasting impact down the road. What folks don't talk about is the fact that every time the Senate elections would occur and you'd have a change in control, you would just constantly flip-flop in policy, and you would just have basically 2 to 4 years of where everything could be undone. And that'd be hard really to run government on. As we look at the Senate, obviously there's some, this is really the check and balances that have been in place for a lot of different administrations. Right now it's 53-45 GOP to Democrat, with the 2 independents caucusing with the Democrats. So it's really 53-47. For the Democrats to get control of the Senate, you're going to have a Trump win and gather 4 seats. Or if Biden wins, you're going to have to get 3 seats. And that's obviously because Senator Harris would be the president pro tem and get to be the tie-breaking vote. what does that look like right now? What are we seeing? Well, there's 35 seats up, 25 are being defended by Republicans and 12 by Democrats. I really think only Doug Jones in Alabama, who was the special election, is the only vulnerable Democrat. There are 8 vulnerable Republicans right now. And particularly, I think in Colorado and Maine are really ones that you're liable to see flip. And so then they only have to get a couple of more. The ones to pay attention right now are clearly going to be Tillis and McSally in North Carolina and Arizona. And the Arizona one is especially interesting right now with Senator McCain's widow throwing her support to Biden and some of the support that they're getting. And the other one I'd throw in here that's not on this list that really has emerged in the last couple of weeks is Senator Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. And Harrison's really had a strong push lately. So we'll have to see what happens there. But I think the idea that the Democrats could gain control of the Senate is becoming a much more realistic kind of viewpoint. In fact, if you look at the polling right now, it looks like the Democrats have the ability to get into those 50 seats. And then, obviously it depends on what happens in the general. So, I don't have a strong opinion on that right now. It's a wait and see. And, the next few weeks are largely going to be really key. And then, the other thing I'll point out is this confirmation hearing for the Judiciary Committee on the new Supreme Court justice is really going to be key in this as well. The Democrats are having to tread lightly on this because they can't go after her as an individual and be perceived as attacking her personally. She's a mother of 7, she's a Catholic, and she's got a strong record, and she's, a female justice. And the last thing the Democrats want to do is attack her personally. They want to attack her record. And so the last few days have been interesting to see how that differs from what we had during the Kavanaugh confirmation. In terms of the House right now, it's 232-198. The Democrats have clear control. You need 218 to control that. There are a few vacancies of folks that have exited. In terms of what the polling is on that, the Democrats clearly have a path forward to remain in control of the House. I just think it's very unlikely that the Republicans would gather control of the House, especially in light of all of the Senate or the House redistricting that's gone on in the last 10 years. And quite honestly, it's gerrymandering in a lot of different ways. But I think it's very unlikely for the Republicans to take control in the general. And you just generally don't see that in the middle of an incumbent president's election. So remains to be seen there, but I think it's unlikely the Democrats are going to be seated. So what's the congressional retirement policy here? Well, right now, a big talk is the HEROES and the HELP Act. Those are the two bills that are kind of a stimulus round for a response to the CARES Act that we got back in March. HEROES is the one that passed the House, and then there's a parallel bill in the Senate. The real question with some of these bills is will it contain any retirement legislation in it? If you look at HEROES as it exists right now, if that were to be enacted, and I just don't see it happening, it does waive the required minimum distributions for 2019 for DC plans and IRAs. It also waives the 60-day once-a-year limitation rules on the RMDs. It clarifies that eligible plans can rely on employee certification for determining the special loans under the CARES Act. Remember, those CARES Act loans expired on September 22nd, and then the distribution's live until the 31st of the year. So there is talk of whether or not you would expand those to take, to be eligible for a further limit of time. We'll have to see. There's some other CARES Act stuff in there. There's some addressing of some of the DB newspaper plans that are out there and some other stuff. I just don't see the Senate taking up the HEROES Act as it is. And then the Senate proposal has some of the stuff as well. Multi-employer pension reform is really a hot button issue partisan-wise. I think generally the parties are bipartisan when it comes to retirement policy. But what we're seeing right now is this pension reform bill, the idea that the defined benefit plans are really struggling, and how should the government react to that. The Democrats obviously support significant reforms and help in that space, and Republicans don't. And this has largely been a deal breaker for getting a lot of retirement legislation done. It's the reason that the Secure Act didn't happen earlier. We also are looking at proposals dealing with RMD relief. There's a bill right now in the Senate. Senator Warren has proposed this several times, but some sort of retirement lost and found for those young workers who transition 5 to 6 times in the first few years of their work life and leave behind small balances that get eaten up by fees and administrative costs, a way to move those into some sort of clearinghouse. That bill's sitting out there. There's bills talking about, should we deal with partial plan terminations at the end of the COVID year as opposed to that 20% reduction force threshold. a lot of employers triggered partial plan terminations, but that's because they had to shut down and they couldn't employ their workers due to local health code rules and things like that. But as soon as they could, they brought them right back. And that really wasn't in the spirit of what a partial plan termination was. So, do we need some sort of legislative fix for that? There's proposals out there right now dealing with defined contribution, particularly safe harbor plans, to delay their contributions under a later wait and see. There's a bill right now that would allow higher contribution limits, the AMORE proposal that's out there, essentially saying, hey, a lot of people were financially hit by COVID in 2020. They couldn't hit their annual plan limits. Can we allow those deficiencies or what they didn't get to in 2020 to roll over to 2021? So let's say somebody didn't get to the $19,000 deferral limit. They were short by $9,000 because they lost their job, but they go back to work. Let's let them have an additional catch-up of $9,000 for next year. That obviously would have a huge financial impact on the federal budget, so that might be hard to do. The financial transaction taxes, like I talked about, there's talk about removing the QACA limits and things like that. And then lastly, I would point out that depending on the outcome of the election, if some of these Department of Labor rules get enacted before the end of the year, you may very well see some legislative attempts to address those. It very well looks like we're going to get a lame duck session. Government is funded right now till December 11th of this year. So you're going to have that short window at the end of the year where they'd have to come back and fund that. And that may be an opportunity for some other legislation. I don't see us get any standalone retirement bill, but some of these things could be enacted as part of something else. I just love this stat. Generally speaking, healthcare has largely been the most important issue in the last couple of elections. If you're a Democrat, you generally say that that's by far the most important issue by 4-1. If you're a Republican, it's the economy. That's why you're seeing the Trump campaign right now talk about their healthcare proposal, and that's why you're seeing Biden talk about his economic proposals right now. They're trying to get those votes to gather over there. So that's kind of a look back on what we're seeing for purposes of the congressional agenda. I want to look back at the SECURE Act, and you're probably all very familiar with this right now. I don't need to spend a lot of time talking about what's in there, but there are a few implications of this. First and foremost, the provision in there dealing with mandatory eligibility for your long-term part-time employees. So these would be employees that work about 500 hours a year for years at a time, but never hit that 1,000-hour threshold to become eligible for a plan. The SECURE Act mandates that beginning on January 1st that employers count their hours for those employees, and over the period of 3 years, if they work 3 consecutive years and hit 500 hours, then you have to allow them into the plan for deferral eligibility purposes. They're not eligible for employer matching contributions. They're not required to be eligible, but they would be for deferral purposes. I think a lot of employers are still struggling with how to address this. It really comes down, do you want the burden of tracking the hours, or do you want to go ahead and just allow them in for deferral purposes only right now, and you're going to have to figure that out. And the IRS did release some guidance recently talking about what happens for those employees once they do enter the plan for prior service for eligibility of employer contributions, and that was a bit of a twist as well. The increased RMD age to 72 from 70.5 is something that was in place. The birth or adoption hardship withdrawals, essentially you can get a tax-free, penalty-free distribution related to costs for birth and adoption. There's been some guidance released on that. The fiduciary safe harbor, for the lifetime income products, the annuity products and DC plans is something that's starting to be enacted. What you're seeing really, is that the market needs to catch up, and we need some of those annuity products for DC plans to come into place. And I think that's going to be a bigger conversation for next year as the DCIO firms start to come in with some products and options there. There's some today, but they're really, it's not a lot. We're going to talk about the lifetime income disclosure proposal that's in place in a little bit, the portability of lifetime income products and some things like that. And then lastly, the expanded non-elective safe harbor. This is a conversation for many of your clients probably, the ability to really wait and see whether or not you want to go safe harbor. You can wait until the end of the year if you provide notice and are willing to do the 3% non-elective, and then you've got until your tax return if you're willing to bump that up to the 4% non-elective. And then lastly, I appreciate everybody being here. Those of you, especially in the audit world, it's 5,500 season. I know that a lot of folks are under that deadline right now to get those in. Just keep in mind, if you don't make the October deadline for this year, the penalties are gone through the roof for that now. And so the DOL has greatly allowed to increase their penalties up to, I think, 10 times or whatever it is. And so what you will see is when those letters start to come out for late filers, inviting them in that delinquent filer program with the DOL, you need to take advantage of that and get your clients in that, because those penalties are going to be really egregious. The last thing I'll just mention, I don't want to spend a lot of time on pooled employer plans. You can see the timeline. This goes back to 2012 when the DOL clearly articulated its preference that these not take place, these open multiple employer plans. And then you fast forward to 2019, the Trump administration tells the DOL, you got to find a pathway here. In September, the DOL issued their group association MEP rules, which really kind of fell flat. And then comes Secure Act, we have an entirely new plan design called the Pooled Employer Plan. For those of you that are not aware of what a PEP is, it's essentially an open multiple employer plan where you take unrelated employers, you bring them in together into a single plan, single 5,500, probably a single audit, although there's some concern that that's not the case, but probably it is. But really what makes this so much different is that one of the employers in this does not have to be the lead dog and be the plan sponsor. You've outsourced the plan sponsor role to a record keeper, a TPA, somebody in that kind of space who's a professional at this and really does it. And I think this has a lot of different viewpoints as to whether or not this is going to be a big thing or not. I generally take a conservative approach and say that, the market needs to develop around this. It's unsure of whether or not pricing is going to be strong in this. But what I really think the opportunity is, and we all know those plans that we work with, you've got a plan and you realize that they constantly have administrative problems. They constantly have compliance problems. They don't have the capacity or the HR staff or benefit staff to really work with the plan, but they still need to have one. That could be a conversation there initially and see if this is a fit. My only advice is, and as somebody who's read a lot of contracts and looked a lot about what the providers are doing in this space, is just make sure you clearly understand what you're putting an employer into, because these arrangements will vary greatly in terms of their structure, their fiduciary outsourcing, and a lot of different things, and they will not all be the same. And so you really need to be understand what type of arrangement you're negotiating with. So I'll leave the pooled employer plans for other sessions. I will say this, we need DOL guidance before these come to fruition and really enter the market. The only guidance we got right now dealt with registration. There's a new form, pooled registration, that's due 90 to 30 days before you start operations as a pooled plan provider. That's going to be the party that acts as the plan sponsor in these. They've got to file with the DOL. They have supplemental forms that are due once they start work. If they find out that they've mistaken anything or there's certain reportable events, and certainly if they're going to terminate the PEP, they would have to file as well. That's the only guidance we've got. That's gone through notice and comment. They got a lot of comments about how expensive this proposal would be and that they needed to water that down. We'll see what happens. But the real guidance needed in this deals with the prohibited transaction exemptions that are needed, particularly with regard to the ability of record keepers to sit in that role, or other professional services firms to sit in that role of the P3 and then turn around and hire themselves as another service provider and essentially determine their own compensation. That presents some significant hurdles under the current prohibited transaction rules, of which there's not a clear pathway to an exemption. So we'll either need the DOL to issue guidance or a class exemption or something in that place. And then somewhat related to that will likely be the fact that a lot of these, in order to be efficiently priced, there'll be the thought that they should have proprietary products. And so again, if a record keeper is acting as the pool plan provider, hires an investment manager who then uses their proprietary investment lineup, how do you navigate the potential for prohibited transactions around that? And what do you do? Most likely you're going to see the need to get the stable value, the target date, especially the target date, or some other default investment. I guess it doesn't have to be a target date, but trying to get that in place as well. We need some sort of guidance. And I think these two issues are particularly why you haven't seen a great deal of influx of folks building and selling them and having them ready right now to go January 1. It's my understanding the DOL has certainly contemplated this. They issued an RFI. They asked these questions. They get a lot of feedback from the industry, and so they realize this. But to the extent that they're going to issue guidance in the next 60 days, I think it's probably unlikely. Could happen, but unlikely because there's a lot of other stuff on their plates. And so what we'll see is a light touch come January 1 in terms of who's actually out there positioning these. But again, I think there's a great opportunity to have discussions about pooled employer plans. But my only advice is to really dig in to the terms and conditions and the design of these sort of things to make sure it's a good fit for any employer you put into it. Just quickly, I wanted to mention some of the COVID-19 relief. I'm not going to talk about the distributions and the loans. You've been beat to death with those. I will say something that generally flew under the radar was the DOL Notice 2020-01 that they issued back in March. Basically, for their special enforcement period, this emergency period that presumably is going to go on until they say it doesn't, they're not taking the hard and fast rule on the plan asset rule that contributions must be submitted as soon as administratively feasible. Now, let me be clear about this. This doesn't give you blanket action to start holding on to the deferrals. But what it does is it understands that due to the nature of the remote workforce, that conditions are going to arise. And should you have something that it necessarily doesn't reach the role of a prohibited transaction. And so what I would recommend is if you have a late deferral here and there because of something COVID related, you document that to the file. You may not necessarily need to file a VFCP that you otherwise would, but you certainly want to document that the file so that your auditor can understand that. And that should any DOL audit happen down the road, they can clearly see that. So that's something that's out there. And then somewhat related in that guidance was also the ability that if you had late participant disclosures for any reason, because maybe paper was the way that you have to communicate with your workforce. This obviously predated the e-disclosure rule that we got in July. But to the extent that you get something like that, if you make a best effort to correct that timely and make sure it doesn't happen, a lot, then they would take a relaxed approach on that as well. So it's kind of a good faith standard. Again, these two provisions are in place from March 2020 until the extension of the emergency period, which we're not sure what that is, but I guess we're still undering it until otherwise notified through DOL guidance. So I think those are two opportunities for you to talk to your clients when they have some of these issues, that there may be a little bit of relief that's out there. I get a lot of questions about committee meetings and investment reviews. My general stance on this is that there's not any exemption for that. So to the extent that your IPS or your committee charter mandates that you meet, you need to keep meeting and need to be conducting planned business. To the extent that you've got to do that virtually, I think that's an okay substitute for in-person meetings probably. But you should continue to have the normal process. And I think that's the general rule under COVID. With no outlook in sight that the things are going to be normal tomorrow, I think generally we as consultants and advisors to our clients should say, let's try to be maintaining the status quo as much as we can. One of the things that's popping up with that, though, is what do you do when you were in the process of an RFI or RFP for a vendor change on the record keeping side, or maybe it's an investment change, and how do you navigate that and your fears that if you go ahead and through with that and your workforce is under furlough or things like that, the messaging is going to be lost and could do some harm. I do think there's an opportunity here. I think what you should do is, if you feel comfortable with the process that you relied upon and it was a good, sound, prudent fiduciary process, then you move forward with the change, and that you stand on what your process was. If you feel, though, that significantly changing the investment, that something's going to be lost, I think significantly a record keeper change in the rollout of that and the new apps that people are relying on and the website changes and stuff like that, there could be a basis for delaying that change. But I think as all things, anytime you do that, you should be documenting why that is and why you're going to rely on that, and use the idea that it's in the best interest of your plan participants and that's prudent to do so. I think obviously you can take advantage of some of the QDIA mapping strategies and things like that to the extent that those are problems. I also think that obviously many of you are having these conversations in light of the market fluctuation that we saw back in March, and depending on what happens come November, if that happens again, this obviously is a great opportunity to have fixed income option conversations. Those folks that are still in money markets or cash accounts, you can do some stuff. It's a great conversation to review your default options to make sure they're still working properly. And then this is a great opportunity for those of you who've never instituted participant education or things like that. Participants more than ever could use some of that education that they're not getting today. Let's shift over to some of the proposals that are out there on the regulatory side. Electronic disclosure is something fascinating to me First of all, because the rules that we had up in place up until the current date predated smartphones, predated high-speed internet. At the time they were issued, we were still under those old dial-up modems that was like a cacophony of pans and pots clashing to the ground. But the DOL, was bound by those old rules. And so the Trump administration via executive order said, hey, it's time to revisit this. And I think this is something that most of us had long known for some time, that, the way that we communicate with participants is by far in need of a change. And so really, the timeline of that is back in August, the president issued an executive order that would do a lot of things. One of those, which is the DOL needed to find a pathway to modernize disclosure. And this was largely a cost-driven thing. We all know that participants don't open paper mail for the most part. It gets thrown away if it ever gets looked at all. And at 80 cents a mailing, at 6 mailings a person, at 137 million participants, that's really a waste of money. And in most cases, plan participants are picking up this cost. And so how can we get there? And so the Department of Labor back in July issued a new safe harbor via guidance. And this is effective July 27th. So I think a lot of plans are already implementing this, or maybe delaying it to January 1st, but they're certainly having conversations about what needs to be done. But essentially, it's an additional safe harbor on top of the old 2020 wired at work kind of rules. Doesn't displace that. So if you're under the old rules and it was working for you and your clients it was working for and their participants, then you can continue to do that. But if it was not working and you found yourself with a lot of the workforce that you couldn't opt in because they didn't have access to a computer during the course of their workday and you had to mail them stuff, then you can move to the new rule. It only applies to covered individuals, which means anybody who's entitled under ERISA to receive covered documents. Covered documents are only the Title I disclosure, so this is not all plan disclosures. Safe harbor notices are not included in that. A lot of the IRS stuff, we're still waiting the IRS to issue parallel guidance that could mirror this, but they haven't done it yet. So we're talking about 40485 notices, SPDs, SMMs, SAR, all those participant disclosures and blackout notices. So what does it do? Well, basically, it says you can opt people into electronic disclosure unless they want paper. There's 2 ways of doing that. Option 1 is you create a website where you post the covered documents. You give everybody a notification that they've been updated. If somebody wants paper, they can opt into paper, but otherwise, this is where things go. There are a lot of smaller requirements about if you replace a document, you got to keep the old one on there for a period of time, those sort of things. But essentially, it's a website posting. If you don't want to do that, then you can deliver the notices via email. And you would do that by sending out notices of either when they become available and where they can be found. That can refer them back to the website, or you can attach the notice itself. Email delivery is not limited, however, just to email. This would include smartphone numbers, an app as well, if a web-based app sort of thing. There's a lot of different mechanisms that the DOL contemplates there. This is not without, however, some hiccups. First of all, there's several protections for participants that have to be recognized. You have to give them paper if they want it. And they have to be able to opt out electronic delivery. You can't piecemeal them every single time. If they say paper, they have to be able to do that for all things going forward. And there can still be a charge of that. But the ability here really is going to be about the ability to capture those participant email addresses. And so this is really where employers are going to have to work with their record keeper, their HR departments, all of those sort of, wherever the onboarding of the employees are, to capture that. You have to issue a notice of internet availability, initial notice via paper, and then obviously you can go to something like that. You don't have to issue that every single time something's available via paper. You can do it initially via paper and then issue a subsequent internet notice. But the big thing, I think, again, is those invalid email addresses. The plan's going to have to figure out a way to be able to understand when a bounce back happens and somebody didn't get effectively the notice, and what are you going to do to take action to correct that. The other thing you're going to have to do is, what do you deal with employees when they leave? You can use a work email address as long as that work email address is something that's generally used for all work communications. You can't build an email database and give them to employees just to get the retirement contribution or retirement notices. But if it's an email that's used for all things, you can use that. If you have that access. But when an employee obviously terminates, they don't have access to their work email, so you're going to have to take steps to figure out what to do with them. Probably in the exit interview, just capture the personal email address. when you get those bad addresses, there's not anything that says you have to monitor the participants' engagement. Did they actually read it or that sort of thing? But what you do need to have is some sort of mechanism in the system that says if you didn't get it, there's a step 2. So capture those bounce back notifications, resend it again. Maybe, maybe the participant typed in the wrong email address. It's at Gmail instead of Hotmail, who knows. Capture a secondary email address or get that smartphone number that you can send it out as well. There's a lot of different ways to do that. I think, interestingly, if you followed the Supreme Court case, the Intel case, one of the issues in there was how do you demonstrate actual knowledge of a plaintiff in that case? And they talked about, do they have to actually open it up and read it? How do you track that? I think the new rules actually present an opportunity to do something like that, depending on how you track those read receipts. So we'll have to keep an eye on that as well. One of the other things I want to mention was the ESG proposal. The DOL proposed a rule. They issued it was a 30-day proposal period, a comment period, not the normal 60-day. Keep in mind that's clearly so that they could try to get this enacted before the end of the year, should the election not go the way that they had planned with the current administration. But basically, it presumes that plans are not vehicles for furthering social goals, and that if you're going to look at ESG factors, then you have to firmly establish that the pecuniary factors, the monetary factors, the performance and the cost and the fees of the investment are really strong, and that somehow ESG factors would impact that. The DOL clearly presumes that ESG could, I think, at least my reading of this, looks like they don't believe that ESG factors would ever have a monetary impact on investment, which I think a lot of people have disproven. Keep in mind, though, I think this is highly politicized. There's a lot of folks out there who clearly draw the factor that ESG funds largely eliminate oil and gas types of investments, gun type related things as well. And so those lobbies are very strong, and they have a potential for wanting that in place. I'm not going to speculate if that's the case, but that's the writing on the wall here. What's going to happen with this? The DOL got a tremendous amount of blowback, about 8,500 comments that said, we don't believe that this is a good idea, and we'll have to see what happens. And there's been threats that depending on what happens, if the DOL moves forward, then Congress would address it. Largely, I think everybody agrees, bipartisan, the financial advisors, the financial service participants, everybody agrees this is not a good thing, so we'll see what happens. Somewhat related to that, around the same time, the DOL did issue an information letter that says we believe that private equity investments are fine and have the go-ahead to be part of the portfolio of DC plan investments. This has largely been something in DB plans for a long time. There's a fiduciary list, which is relatively a low bar of how you would include these. Now, it's not going to be a standalone investment. You can't take a portion of your plan and invest in private equity. But what you can do is have private equity be a portion of a fund of funds, like a managed account, a target date series, or some other sort of fund that has an underlying portfolio. Private equity can now be included. That's live. I think a lot of products are hurrying to market right now. Again, it's getting congressional pushback of how easy this was to enact, and it didn't go through rulemaking, but the other side, the ESG, did. Proxy voting is somewhat related to this. They issued a proposed rule that would expand, basically largely limit the ability of plan sponsors to vote proxies. I don't know a lot of employers that do it. It's largely done by their investment management firms. But the idea here is that if you're going to vote proxies, you have to affirmatively establish and document that that voting of that proxy would not cost the plan any money and would have a monetary impact on it. This went through a 30-day public comment period, got a lot of pushback as well, congressional, similar to the ESG proposal. So we'll have to see what happens. I think largely the DOL is going to try to get these into place. And by DOL, I mean the administration directing them. They're going to try to do this before the end of the year. If the winds change and we get a blue tide, they can go ahead and repeal these. They can do it through the Congressional Review Act, but it becomes more difficult than you can do it just by an executive order. Quickly, I'll mention fiduciary advice. You guys have all been paying attention to this. It's back. The DOL has reproposed the rule, much more watered down rule than what we got under the Obama administration. The 5-part test is back. And largely, I think this is going to be one of those things that, if the DOL and access is going to be a blip in the radar for most folks. They got a lot of insight, but it really mirrors the SEC's rule. So I don't think this is going to be a huge issue. I think this will be a massive issue if the Biden campaign wins the election and they try to go back to the old rule. Then you're going to see the fight that we've seen. And then lastly, I want to close with the lifetime income disclosures. Just quickly, the DOL, in response to the Secure Act's requirement, issued a proposed rule that would say on participant statements, you've got to display what an annuitized version of their balance would be. So if you got a $100,000 balance and you retire today, what is your monthly stream of income going to be? The DOL has attempted various versions of this since about 2012, 2014. They never came into place. But the idea is that we need to have more clarity around what the balance is to change participant behavior. I think a lot of plans already have some version of this. They're probably much more robust. There's calculators where you have all kinds of data inputs that tells you if we're on track for retirement. The two big issues are this. First of all, there was always the concern that if you put this as a mandate and it goes on there and the projections are wrong, can a participant sue the fiduciary for a misleading statement? Clearly, the DOL says here that if you use our basic assumptions and disclosures, then you have a fiduciary safe harbor. The other part of this is this largely a mandate will trigger folks to potentially go to the lowest common denominator. And you may see plan sponsors get rid of these really nice calculators and things that are out there. And so what we're working on right now is to what extent can we use what we have today and still get that safe harbor? And is there a pathway to do that? And that's a better outcome. You know, I don't know what's going to happen with this. The Secure Act said they have to do it, so we're going to see something. I think the DOL is listening, but they've got a pretty long lead time. We probably won't see a final version of this until next year sometime. I knew I threw a lot of information out there, but I'm right at my time. I want to make sure I don't see any questions that we've gotten from anybody. So I've either said so much at you, your head's spinning, but hopefully the one thing I can communicate is, and I think you've seen this statement over and over, elections have consequences. For us in the retirement industry, clearly this election will have consequences in a lot of different ways, both at the presidential level, both in the Senate and the House, and then certainly with regard to whatever administration comes into place and their role with directing the enforcement agencies and what their agendas are. So, you know, I don't know where anybody's political leanings are. There's a lot of stuff that's at play here. But I think as you go out and you talk with clients, I think it's worth mentioning these issues in the upcoming weeks. And then certainly, depending on the outcome of November, we'll have a lot of opportunity to talk about what we think is going to happen as a result of this. So I'm not seeing any questions out there. I'll be happy to answer any. My email is shenson@lockton.com. I'm happy to share my deck with anybody. If anybody has a question or wants to talk further, shoot me a line. This is the world I live in. It's been an interesting last few months. The next few weeks are going to be really interesting for me. And hopefully the next time we talk, we'll have a new conversation to talk about, and that'll be beneficial for all of us. So thank you, everybody, for your time, and I hope you have a good day.